The cold sank through the soles of her thin slippers, a damp and biting misery that felt like a final judgment. And Lee stood pressed against the rough-hewn wall of the general store, a ghost in a faded pink dress that offered no defense against the encroaching winter. The fabric, once a comfort, was now a banner of her vulnerability, thin and frayed just like her hold on this life. Men walked past, their boots churning the half-frozen mud, their eyes either sliding over her as if she were a piece of refuse or lingering with a contempt that was somehow worse than invisibility. They saw a foreigner, a widow, a burden. They did not see the woman who had once known the warmth of a different sun, the sound of a language that did not bite and scrape. Her husband, Lin, had promised her a life here, a small piece of a golden mountain. He had found only a shallow grave and a debt she could never hope to pay. Now, the man who held that debt, a merchant named Finch with a perpetually sour face and small, greedy eyes, stood in the doorway of the laundry she had called home. He had tossed her meager bundle into the street, the cloth sack splitting open to spill her few belongings into the filth. A single porcelain teacup, her last connection to her mother, lay shattered. The sight of it broke something inside her that had, until that moment, stubbornly refused to yield. She did not cry. Tears were a luxury, a warmth she could not afford to waste. Instead, she wrapped her arms around herself, a futile gesture against the cold that came from both the air and the hearts of men. It was then that he appeared, a figure so immense he seemed to block out what little light the grey sky offered. Thomas did not ride into town so much as descend upon it, a piece of the mountain given human form. He was a giant of a man, broad in the shoulder and deep in the chest, with a cascade of dark, untamed hair and a beard that covered half his face. His presence was a silent disruption to the town's grimy rhythm. He moved with a slow, deliberate weight, his eyes, the color of a winter sky, taking in everything without hurry. He had come down from his remote solitude for supplies, a journey he made only when necessity clawed at him more fiercely than the loneliness. He needed grain for his horse, salt for curing meat, and perhaps a new axe head if the blacksmith had one worth the price. He had no time for the squabbles of smaller men, for their posturing and their petty cruelties. But he saw her. He saw the woman in the thin pink dress, shivering against the wall. He saw the shattered porcelain in the mud. And he saw Finch, strutting with the cheap authority of a man who enjoys kicking things smaller than himself. Finch was pointing a thick finger at Lee, his voice a greasy smear in the cold air. She's got nothing. The debt's mine to collect, and I'm collecting this room. She can find her charity elsewhere. A few onlookers snickered, their faces pinched and mean. Thomas felt a low, unfamiliar rumble in his chest. It was the grating of a stone that had been long undisturbed. He had spent years turning his back on the world of men, finding more honesty in the silence of the pines and the brutality of the winter snow. But this was a different kind of brutality, a cowardly, sneering kind that preyed on the helpless. He tied his horse's reins to the hitching post, the motion economical and sure, and walked towards the scene. His steps were heavy, each one a punctuation mark in the tense silence that had fallen as the townspeople noticed him. Finch puffed out his chest, trying to hold his ground as the mountain man's shadow fell over him. It was a futile effort. Thomas was twice his size and carried the chilling stillness of a predator. Thomas didn't speak. He simply looked from Finch to the shivering woman, then down at the broken cup in the mud. His gaze was not angry, not in the hot, sputtering way of town folk. It was something colder and heavier, like the weight of a glacier. He bent down, his huge frame folding with surprising grace, and picked up the largest piece of the shattered porcelain. He held it in his palm, the delicate white fragment looking impossibly fragile against his calloused skin. Then he looked back at Finch. How much? His voice was a low rasp, unused to conversation, like the sound of rocks grinding together. Finch, momentarily flustered by the giant's focus, stammered. The debt? It's $20. For her husband's tools and supplies. A debt of honor. The word sounded hollow and false even to his own ears. Thomas reached into a leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a small stack of coins, counting them out with a thick thumb. He dropped them into Finch's outstretched hand, the clink of the metal unnaturally loud. He didn't stop there. He pulled out another coin, a silver dollar, and held it out. For the cup, Finch stared at the coin, his greed warring with his fear. He snatched it. Thomas then turned his gaze fully on Lee. She flinched, her dark eyes wide with a terror that expected a new kind of cruelty. He was an unknown monster, larger and more unpredictable than the ones she knew. He held out his hand, palm up. In it lay the piece of her broken cup. For a long moment, she just stared. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she reached out her trembling fingers and took it. His hand was rough, but his touch as she retrieved the shard was unexpectedly gentle. "Come," he said. It wasn't a question or a request. It was a simple statement of fact, a solution to a problem he had decided to solve. She didn't know what to do, where to go. The entire town was watching. To refuse was to remain here, at their mercy. To go with him was to step into an abyss. He was a wild man, a creature of the mountains they whispered about. But in his eyes, she had not seen the familiar leer of contempt. She had seen nothing. A calm, deep emptiness, like a frozen lake. It was more terrifying and yet, somehow, safer than the simmering hatred of the town. Without another word, he gathered her spilled belongings, stuffing them back into the sack with an almost comical awkwardness, his large hands clumsy with the small, feminine items. He slung the sack over his shoulder, then walked to his horse. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He simply trusted that she would. And Lee took one last look at the hostile faces, at the muddy street that had offered her nothing but grief, and made her choice. She walked towards the mountain man and his horse, her steps small but steady. He loaded his sacks of grain, then mounted the animal in one fluid motion. He looked down at her and extended a hand. It was a long way up. Swallowing her fear, she placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, enveloping her small hand completely as he lifted her, seating her in front of him on the broad back of the horse. She was small against his immense frame, the thin fabric of her dress a stark contrast to his heavy furs and leather. The horse shifted, and she instinctively leaned back against the solid wall of his chest. It was warm, a shocking, living heat that seeped through her worn clothes. He nudged the horse forward, and they began their journey out of the town, leaving the gaping faces and muttered speculations behind them. The ride was silent, broken only by the rhythmic plodding of the horse's hooves and the sigh of the wind through the barren trees. She did not speak. He did not speak. The world grew wilder around them, the shabby buildings of the town giving way to rolling hills, then to the steep, pine-choked inclines of the mountains. The air grew thinner, colder. Snow began to fall, soft, silent flakes that clung to his beard and her dark hair. She huddled deeper into herself, trying to fight the bone-deep chill. After what felt like an eternity, Thomas reached behind him and unstrapped a heavy wool blanket. Without a word, he draped it around her shoulders. The coarse fabric was heavy and smelled of wood smoke, pine, and him. It was the first true warmth she had felt all day. The gesture was so simple, so practical, yet it felt like a profound kindness. She clutched the blanket tightly, the fear in her heart easing its frantic grip by the smallest of margins. He was a stranger, a giant taking her to a place she could not imagine, but he had given her a blanket. It was a start. They rode higher and higher, the trail narrowing until it was barely a path at all. The silence between them was not empty, it was filled with a weight of unspoken questions, of her terror and his stoic resolve. She wondered what he wanted from her, what price she would have to pay for this rescue. He wondered what in God's name he was doing, bringing a fragile, broken woman into the heart of his solitude. He had lived alone for so long, the presence of another human being was a jarring intrusion, a disruption to the deep, silent conversation he held with the mountains. Yet, the memory of her standing there, so utterly defeated, had moved something in him. It was an old, rusted instinct, to protect, to shield, to stand between the wolf and the lamb. As dusk began to bleed across the snow-covered peaks, they finally arrived. His home was not a cabin, not a house. It was a crude shelter built into an overhang of rock, a lean-to of thick logs and packed earth, with a heavy animal hide for a door. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, a sign he had banked the fire before leaving. It was a raw, primal place, built for survival, not comfort. This was his world, and she was now a part of it. He dismounted and then lifted her down, his hand spanning her waist. She felt as light as a doll in his grip. He pushed aside the hide flap, revealing a small, dark interior lit by the faint glow of embers in a stone hearth. The air inside was thick with the scent of wood smoke and cured meat. There was a rough-hewn table, a single stool, and a bed of furs in the corner. That was all. He gestured for her to enter. She hesitated for a moment on the threshold, then stepped inside, clutching the blanket around her. He followed, bringing in their supplies. The space felt impossibly small with him in it. He moved to the hearth, adding logs from a pile nearby until a proper fire crackled to life, casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. The warmth was immediate and life-giving. He took a tin pot, filled it with snow from just outside the door, and set it near the fire to melt. He worked with a quiet efficiency, his movements economical and sure. He seemed to have forgotten she was there, lost in the familiar rhythm of his solitary life. Anli stood by the wall, a silent observer, feeling like a misplaced ghost. She did not know the rules of this place. She did not know what was expected of her. So she did what she had always done when faced with uncertainty: she made herself useful. She took the small sack of her belongings and found a corner to place it. She unrolled the blanket he had given her and folded it neatly. Seeing a worn broom made of bound twigs, she began to gently sweep the packed earth floor, collecting the dust and stray debris from his day's work. Thomas stopped what he was doing and watched her. The small, repetitive motion of her sweeping was a strange and foreign sound in his shelter. For years, this place had known only his movements, his silence. Her quiet industry was an intrusion, yet it was not an unwelcome one. It was soft. The firelight caught the silver threads in her dark hair and cast a warm glow on her pale, tired face. He saw not just a victim, but a woman of quiet strength, a person trying to reclaim a piece of dignity in a world that had stripped her of it. Days bled into weeks, and a fragile routine began to form, an unspoken treaty between two solitudes. Thomas would rise before dawn, his large frame moving with a hushed grace as he prepared for the day. He would leave to check his trap lines or hunt, disappearing into the vast, snowy wilderness for hours. Anli would wake to the silence he left behind, the embers in the hearth his only parting message. At first, she was paralyzed by fear, but the simple, pressing needs of survival gave her purpose. She learned the rhythms of his home. She tended the fire, ensuring it never went out. She took the tough, stringy meat he brought back and, with patience and skill, stewed it into something savory and tender. She discovered his small cache of dried herbs and used them to flavor their meals, transforming grim sustenance into something that tasted of care. She mended his worn buckskin clothes with tiny, perfect stitches, her needle and thread moving with a speed and precision that fascinated him. He would return at dusk, weary and cold, to find the shelter warm, a bowl of hot stew waiting for him, and a strange sense of peace settling where there had once been only stark emptiness. He never thanked her in words, but he would leave an offering on the table for her, a handful of winterberries he'd found, a bird's feather of impossible blue, or a smooth, flat stone from the creek bed. These were his words, his acknowledgement of her presence. She, in turn, would accept them with a small, quiet nod, her gratitude as silent and profound as his. They spoke rarely, their conversations limited to practicalities. The wood is low, more snow is coming, is the water container full? Yet, in the shared space, a different kind of language was developing. It was in the way he began to chop the firewood into smaller, more manageable pieces for her. It was in the way she started humming a soft, sad melody as she worked, a sound that filled the corners of the shelter with a gentle melancholy. He began to look for her when he crested the final ridge on his way home, his eyes seeking the flicker of firelight from his shelter, a beacon that now meant more than just warmth. It meant her. The winter deepened its hold on the mountain, unleashing a brutal, relentless cold that seemed to suck the very breath from the air. The snow piled in great drifts against their shelter, isolating them completely from the world below. It was during this deep freeze that Anli fell ill. It started with a shiver she couldn't shake, a deep weariness that settled into her bones. Soon, a fever took hold, leaving her weak and delirious on the bed of furs. Thomas was thrown into a state of quiet panic. He was a man who understood the dangers of the mountain, the sudden storm, the predatory animal, the treacherous fall. But this was a different kind of threat, an enemy from within that he could not fight with an axe or a knife. He watched her toss and turn, her face flushed, her breath coming in shallow rasps. Her vulnerability was a physical ache in his own chest. He was clumsy in his role as a nurse. His hands, so adept at skinning a deer or setting a snare, were rough and awkward as he tried to spoon broth between her cracked lips. He bathed her forehead with cloths dipped in melted snow, his touch surprisingly gentle. He sat with her through the long, dark nights, adding wood to the fire, listening to her ragged breathing, a silent, hulking guardian against the encroaching darkness. During the worst of the fever, she would murmur in her own language, words he could not understand but whose meaning he could feel in their sorrowful cadence. Sometimes she would cry out, her hands reaching for something that wasn't there. In those moments, he would rest his large hand on her shoulder, a steady, grounding presence in her fevered storm. He felt a fierce, terrifying protectiveness he had not experienced in decades. The thought of losing her, of this small, warm light being extinguished from his world, was unbearable. This fragile woman had, without trying, breached the formidable walls he had built around his heart. Her survival had become inextricably linked with his own. After 3 days, the fever broke. An-Li woke one morning to find the world clear and calm. The first thing she saw was Thomas, asleep in the stool by the hearth, his head slumped forward, his massive frame folded in exhaustion. The fire was burning steadily. A pot of water was warm beside it. She saw the damp cloths on the table, the half-empty bowl of broth. She understood, with a sudden, overwhelming clarity, that he had saved her. That evening, as she sat propped up on the furs, sipping a weak tea he had brewed for her, the silence between them was different. It was no longer a space of caution, but one of shared experience, of a battle fought and won together. She looked at him, at his tired face illuminated by the firelight, and for the first time, she spoke of things beyond the immediate needs of the day. "My husband," she began, her voice a little rough, "he was a good man. He believed in this country. He believed people were kind." She told him about their journey, the hopes they had carried, and the slow, grinding disappointment that had followed. She spoke of Lin's death from a lung sickness and the crushing loneliness that followed, a loneliness made worse by the town's open hostility. They looked at me as if I was a disease. Thomas listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. Her story was one of 1,000 heartbreaks he had heard whispers of from the world below, but hearing it from her, in this small, warm space, gave it a weight that settled deep inside him. When she finished, her voice trailing off into a weary whisper, he did not offer empty platitudes or clumsy words of comfort. He simply nodded, a slow, grave acknowledgement of her pain. He stood up and pulled on his heavy coat. He took his axe from its place by the door. "Where are you going?" she asked, a flicker of her old fear returning. "It's dark." He paused at the door, turning back to look at her. "The trees won't fell themselves," he said, his voice low and certain. "This place is not a home. I'm going to build you 1 inch." And so he began. The sound of his axe became the new rhythm of their days, a steady, resonant heartbeat echoing through the silent, snow-filled forest. Every day, he would work from dawn until the light failed, felling pines with a relentless, focused energy. He was not just cutting wood, he was carving out a future, building a fortress against the cruelty of the world she had known. An-Li, growing stronger each day, would bring him his midday meal, a hot stew in a covered pot. They would sit together on a fallen log, sharing the food in a comfortable silence, the vast wilderness their only witness. She watched him work, marveling at his strength. He could lift logs that seemed impossibly heavy, his muscles cording under his skin. He notched them with a precision that was like artistry, fitting them together so perfectly that no wind could find its way through. She began to help in small ways. She gathered moss and clay to chink the gaps between the logs. She stripped the bark from smaller branches that would be used for the roof. They worked as a team, their movements falling into a natural, unspoken partnership. One afternoon, as he was hoisting a roof beam into place, he slipped on a patch of ice. He let out a sharp grunt of pain as the heavy log grazed his arm, tearing his sleeve and the skin beneath. An-Li rushed to his side. "Let me see," she insisted, her voice firm. He reluctantly showed her the long, deep gash. Without hesitation, she led him back to the shelter, washed the wound with clean, warm water, and bound it tightly with strips of clean linen from one of her few remaining garments. Her touch was gentle but sure, her brow furrowed in concentration. As she finished, her fingers lingered on his arm for a moment longer than necessary. He looked down at her dark hair falling across her face, and felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. It was in these small moments that their love story was written, not in grand declarations, but in shared labor, quiet care, and the steady, patient construction of a shared life. The cabin rose from the snow-covered ground, a testament to his devotion. It was small, just a single room, but it was sturdy and true. It had a proper stone fireplace he built with his own hands, a floor of smooth, split logs, and a small window cut into the south-facing wall, covered with a carefully scraped and oiled piece of hide that let in a soft, milky light. The day they moved in was a quiet celebration. He carried her few belongings from the old shelter to the new one. She laid out the furs on the new raised bed platform he had built. She placed the single mended piece of her mother's teacup on the new mantelpiece above the hearth. It was no longer a symbol of what she had lost, but a marker of where she had begun anew. That night, they sat before the first fire in their new home. The flames danced and leaped, filling the small space with a golden, flickering warmth. The cabin smelled of fresh-cut pine and clean earth. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, there was only a profound and peaceful silence. An-Li looked around the room, her heart full. It was the first place she had felt truly safe since she had left her homeland. She turned her eyes to Thomas, who was watching her, his expression unreadable in the shifting light. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate for the immensity of her gratitude. He just shook his head slightly, as if to say the words were not necessary. He reached out, his large hand gently cupping her cheek. His thumb stroked her skin, a touch that was both rough and tender. "I was alone for a long time," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I thought it was what I wanted." To be away from everything, he looked into her eyes, and for the first time, she saw past the stoicism, past the wildness, to the deep well of loneliness he had carried within him. "I was wrong," he finished simply. An-Li leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. She raised her hand and placed it over his, holding his hand against her face. No more words were needed. In the heart of the unforgiving mountains, in a small cabin built by hands of love, two broken people had found not just a shelter, but a home. They had found each other. The seasons turned. The deep snows of winter slowly receded, giving way to the tender green shoots of spring. The mountain came alive with the sound of melting ice and birdsong. Life for Thomas and An-Li settled into a new, peaceful rhythm, one dictated not just by survival, but by companionship. He taught her the names of the mountain plants, which ones were for medicine, which for food. She taught him how to cultivate a small garden in a sunny patch of cleared land near the cabin, her hands coaxing life from the stubborn soil. They were rarely more than a few feet apart, yet their life was not one of clinging dependence. It was a partnership, a quiet dance of two souls moving in harmony. He would still go out to hunt, but he was never gone for long, and he always returned to the sight of her working in her garden or the smell of bread baking in the small stone oven she had ingeniously built beside the cabin. Her quiet laughter, a sound he had never expected to hear, became as much a part of his world as the cry of the hawk or the rustle of the wind in the pines. She learned to read the sky with him, to know when a storm was brewing in the west. He learned to understand the subtle shifts in her moods, to know when she was thinking of the past by the distant look in her eyes. On those days, he would not speak, but would simply sit with her, his solid presence a silent comfort, a reminder that she was no longer alone in her sorrow. One evening, as they sat on the small porch he had added to the cabin, watching the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple behind the distant peaks, she rested her head on his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. The man who had ridden into town for grain, a solitary giant closed off from the world, was gone. In his place was a man who had discovered that the truest strength was not in enduring alone, but in building a life with another. He had left his isolation behind and, in doing so, had found his fate, a destiny not of loneliness and survival, but of love and renewal, forever changed by the quiet, resilient woman in a faded pink dress.